The courtroom was thick with tension that day, as though the very air itself held its breath in anticipation. It wasn't just the stifling summer heat that pressed down on everyone, it was the weight of an impending judgment, one that would alter the course of a young man's life forever. In Fresno, California, all eyes were trained on Judge Malcolm Brewer, a man whose reputation for swift, unyielding decisions had preceded him into the room. At 62, with over 3 decades of experience on the bench, his weathered face spoke volumes of the countless lives he had shaped, his rulings always as firm and resolute as the gavel he wielded. He wasn't known for empathy, nor for giving second chances. His decisions were final, his demeanor unshakable. At the defense table stood 24-year-old Ryan Hale, his body taut with barely contained anxiety. His hands, trembling slightly, betrayed the calmness in his eyes, the quiet defiance in his gaze. It was the expression of someone who had fought his whole life to be seen, to be heard. A life spent trying to prove that he was more than what the world saw, and now, he faced the culmination of it all. For the past weeks, Ryan had proclaimed his innocence, even during his arrest for the violent robbery of a downtown jewelry store that had left one man critically wounded. Yet, today, he knew, it was futile to speak. His words would never reach the judge's ears. "Mr. Hale," Judge Brewer's deep voice rumbled, cutting through the thick air. "You stand convicted by a jury of your peers for crimes that have caused irreparable harm to this community. Your actions were not only reckless but calculated, and you have shown no remorse." The words stung, each syllable like a hammer striking the anvil of Ryan's fate. His mother, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, couldn't hold back a quiet sob. She had pleaded with anyone who would listen, begged the court to see her son as more than a case number. To remember the boy who once dreamed of becoming a firefighter, the child she raised with love, with hope. But all the pleas, all the stories, all the years of her motherhood had been drowned out by the cold, hard evidence that the prosecution had laid bare, eyewitness accounts, damning surveillance footage, and an anonymous tip that had sealed Ryan's fate. "I hereby sentence you to 60 years in state prison," Judge Brewer declared, his gavel crashing down with finality. The sharp, echoing sound hung in the room, as if the very air had just been sucked out of it. The gasp from the crowd was audible, but for Ryan, the world around him faded into silence. He stood still, his face a mask, lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't cry out. He didn't protest. He merely turned, one last time, to glance at his mother. The love and sorrow in his eyes were there for a heartbeat, before he was led away, his shackled steps reverberating softly down the hallway, each footfall echoing the gravity of what had just happened. Judge Brewer returned to his chambers later that day, seeking solitude after the drama of the courtroom. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, staring into the swirling liquid, as if it might offer him some clarity, some answer to the day's events. It had been long, the trial intense, but to him, it was over. Justice had been served. Or so he thought. Unbeknownst to him, the truth, hidden beneath the surface of everything he had seen, was about to rise up, clawing its way back to the light, demanding to be heard. The trial had captivated local headlines, the so-called Hale robbery case dominating the news in Fresno for weeks. The crime had been an act of chaos, an armed man storming Carter's jewelers in broad daylight, snatching over $150,000 worth of stolen goods, and leaving one man, Samuel Gaines, fighting for his life after being struck in the crossfire. A part-time mechanic with no criminal history, Ryan Hale had been arrested 2 weeks after the robbery, following an anonymous tip that had identified him as the suspect seen fleeing the scene. The prosecution presented a damning case, the stolen goods, found in a storage unit under Ryan's name, the grainy surveillance footage showing a man who resembled Ryan in build and gait, eyewitnesses who swore they recognized his voice. And perhaps most damning of all, fingerprints found on the weapon left behind at the scene. But through it all, Ryan maintained his innocence. "I didn't do this," he had told the jury, his voice quiet yet firm. "I wasn't anywhere near that store. I've never even touched a gun." His alibi, that he was working a double shift at the auto shop that day, unraveled under scrutiny. His boss, when called to testify, admitted he couldn't account for Ryan's whereabouts for the entire day. The prosecution's closing arguments were sharp and relentless, declaring that Ryan had thought he could outsmart the law, but the evidence didn't lie. In stark contrast, Ryan's defense felt hollow, almost defeated. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," his lawyer had pleaded, his voice lacking the conviction necessary to sway anyone, "there are holes in this case. Doubts. Isn't that enough to give this young man the benefit of the doubt?" The jury didn't buy it. Their deliberations were swift, less than 3 hours. The verdict was clear, guilty on all counts. Ryan didn't flinch, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed the emotions surging inside him. And so, Judge Brewer, with his customary impartiality, had prepared to deliver what he believed was the just punishment for Ryan's crimes. He had dealt with hardened criminals, master manipulators who could twist the truth with ease. To him, Ryan was no different. As he surveyed the courtroom, his gaze landed on the young man, no remorse, no sign of redemption. It was the same look he had seen 1,000 times before. When the sentence was read, there was a quiet exhale in the room. Relief for the victims and their families. Devastation for Ryan and his mother. The gavel had come down, and with it, the finality of the justice system. But later, as Judge Brewer signed the sentencing papers, something gnawed at him. A vague discomfort he couldn't shake. It was a feeling he couldn't quite identify, something about the case didn't sit right. He dismissed it, telling himself it was fatigue. He couldn't know then, but this small, unplaceable unease would grow into something much larger, something that would tear apart everything he thought he knew about justice and truth. The real story had just begun, and it was waiting, hidden in plain sight. What Judge Brewer hadn't yet realized was that the trial, the conviction, everything that had happened up until that moment, was just the surface. Beneath it all, the truth was lurking, preparing to surface in a way that would shake the very foundations of the justice system. It was coming for him, and it would change everything. It started one quiet Wednesday evening when Judge Brewer sat in his study, sifting through case files. Retirement had been on his mind, but there was still work to be done. A new case involving police misconduct had landed on his desk, demanding attention. As he flipped through the papers, one document caught his eye, a seemingly insignificant evidence log from a previous investigation. He skimmed over it at first, dismissing it as nothing more than an odd detail in the sea of paperwork. But something about it lingered. A name caught his attention. It stood out like a dark shadow in the midst of the routine paperwork. Brewer's gaze snapped to it, and his pulse quickened. It was Ryan Hale, a name he thought he'd put behind him. He sat back in his chair, brow furrowing as he stared at the evidence log. It was strange for names to resurface in unrelated cases, but this felt different, urgent. His eyes quickly scanned the page, heart hammering in his chest. The log detailed items from an unrelated robbery case, one that had occurred around the same time as the notorious Carter's Jewelers robbery. His hand froze on the page when he reached a particular item, a gun. The description matched the weapon used in Ryan Hale's case, the weapon that had sealed the young man's fate. But something was wrong. This gun hadn't been introduced as evidence during Ryan's trial. In fact, it hadn't been mentioned at all. Brewer leaned forward, the weight of this discovery pressing down on him like a vice. His fingers trembled slightly as he cross-referenced the serial number against the documents in his memory. It was an exact match, the same make, the same scratches on the barrel. But according to the report, this weapon had been seized during an unrelated arrest 2 days after the robbery. How could that be? Brewer muttered to himself. His heart raced as he began to piece together the possibilities. If this gun had been in police custody, it could not have been the one used in the Carter's robbery. And if it wasn't the weapon from the crime, then whose fingerprints were on it? A cold shiver ran down his spine. Something was off, he could feel it in the pit of his stomach. For decades, Brewer had navigated the intricate, sometimes murky, legal system. He knew how easily the smallest detail could be buried or overlooked, but this didn't feel like an oversight. This felt deliberate. His mind was set, he would get to the bottom of this, no matter what it cost him. He requested the full case file from the unrelated robbery, his unease growing with every passing second. When it arrived the next morning, Brewer's eyes widened as he opened the thick folder, packed with police reports, witness statements, and photographs. The deeper he dug, the more the tangled threads of this case unraveled before him. The arresting officer in the unrelated case, the one who had seized the gun, was none other than Detective Lewis, the same detective who had testified during Ryan's trial. But it wasn't just this detail that disturbed him. The anonymous tip that had led to Ryan's arrest, the one that had seemed so insignificant at the time, now stood out as glaringly suspicious. Brewer's unease grew to full-blown dread as he requested a subpoena for the tip line records. When the documents arrived, Brewer's blood ran cold. The call hadn't come from a concerned citizen, as he had once thought. It had come from a burner phone, one that was registered under Detective Lewis's name. The walls of his office seemed to close in around him, suffocating him as the horrific realization began to set in. Ryan Hale had been framed. The evidence had been manipulated, the testimony orchestrated. Brewer's stomach twisted with a mixture of disgust and guilt as he thought of the young man he had sentenced to 60 years, a man who might have been innocent all along. For the first time in his long career, the law felt slippery, like quicksand beneath his feet. What had once been his unwavering foundation now felt shaky and unreliable. The weight of this discovery crushed him. But there was no time for self-pity. He knew what had to be done. The truth was out there, and it was his duty to find it. He wasn't about to let it slip away. That night, Brewer couldn't sleep. His mind raced with everything he had uncovered, but no answers seemed to offer him peace. He worked well into the night, reviewing stacks of legal papers and making frantic notes. The case had consumed him. Then, one day, he reached out to an old friend, a retired investigator named Daniel Hayes. They met at a diner, the flickering neon lights casting long shadows over their coffee cups. Hayes was a man of few words but knew corruption when he saw it. Brewer laid out his findings, and Hayes listened carefully, his face hardening with every word. "This isn't just negligence," Hayes said, his voice low but firm. "If what you're telling me is true, someone went to a hell of a lot of trouble to make sure that kid took the fall." Brewer nodded, grimly. "I need proof, Dan. Solid proof." Hayes agreed to help, and within days, they were both buried in records, witness statements, and internal memos. What they found was staggering: falsified reports, missing evidence logs, and witness statements that had been manipulated to fit the prosecution's narrative. One witness, a store clerk, had originally identified another man as the suspect before changing his statement under suspicious circumstances. Hayes tracked him down, finding the man holed up in a rundown apartment on the edge of town. When they confronted him, the man broke down, his hands shaking. "I didn't want to do it," he confessed, his voice trembling. "But Detective Lewis, he pressured me. Said if I didn't, they'd arrest me for obstruction." The name Detective Lewis sent a surge of anger through Brewer's veins. This was the same officer who had planted the false tip and concealed vital evidence. As Brewer and Hayes dug deeper into Lewis's past, they discovered a pattern, a history of intimidation, falsifying evidence, and coercing confessions, all of which had been conveniently ignored by his superiors. But the breakthrough came when Hayes managed to recover deleted emails from Lewis's police account. One email in particular stood out, addressed to the district attorney. In it, Lewis detailed a plan to ensure a conviction in the Carter's Jewelers case. Attached was a list of fabricated evidence and manipulated witness statements. Brewer's rage intensified as he read the email, the very system he had devoted his life to exposed as rotten. But there was no time to mourn the loss of his faith in the law. Brewer had the proof he needed. The next step, however, would come with immense risk. Lewis had powerful allies within the department, and Brewer knew that exposing the truth could cost him everything: his career, his reputation, maybe even his life. But when he thought of Ryan Hale, sitting in prison for a crime he hadn't committed, Brewer's resolve hardened. "We go public," he told Hayes, his voice steady despite the danger that loomed over them. It was time to expose the truth. No matter the cost. The following day, Judge Brewer filed a motion to reopen Ryan's case, attaching the irrefutable evidence he had uncovered against Detective Lewis. The motion sent shockwaves through the courthouse, but Brewer wasn't finished yet. Alongside it, he lodged a formal complaint with the Department of Justice, demanding an independent investigation into Lewis and the Fresno Police Department. The fallout was immediate. Anonymous threats poured in, warning Brewer to back off. His colleagues, once allies, distanced themselves, and the media began to stir doubts about his motives. But Brewer stood his ground. The truth had surfaced, and there was no going back. As the storm around him intensified, Brewer understood that the real battle had only just begun. The public's reaction was explosive. Headlines blared accusations of corruption within the Fresno Police Department, and outrage spread like wildfire. Brewer felt the scorching heat of scrutiny for the first time in decades. Some hailed him as a hero, a voice of truth in the darkness. Others called him a traitor, someone who had turned against the very system he had sworn to uphold. But it wasn't just the public turning on him. The threats escalated. Brewer began receiving phone calls at all hours, long moments of silence on the other end, followed by the click of the line going dead. One morning, he stepped outside to find his car tires slashed. A crude note was scrawled on the windshield, "Drop it, or else." Brewer's resolve hardened. He had seen firsthand the devastating consequences of a broken system. Ryan Hale's face haunted him, young, hopeful, and unjustly imprisoned. Meanwhile, Detective Lewis was fighting back with everything he had. Through his attorney, he denied all allegations, dismissing Brewer's motion as a baseless attack. "This is just a vendetta," Lewis declared, his polished demeanor standing in stark contrast to the mounting evidence against him. Brewer sat in his living room, watching the televised interview, his frustration simmering. The lies were bold, calculated, but Brewer had something Lewis didn't: he had the truth. As the investigation progressed, Brewer's ally, Daniel Hayes, unearthed a game-changing piece of evidence. Security camera footage from a parking lot near the jewelry store on the day of the robbery had mysteriously never been submitted during the trial. The footage showed a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to Lewis, leaving the scene with a duffel bag. Brewer's heart raced as he watched the tape. It wasn't just exculpatory, it was damning. The robbery hadn't been a random act of violence, it had been orchestrated by Lewis himself. The next step was perilous but clear. Brewer called for an emergency hearing to present this new evidence. The courtroom was charged with tension as the footage played on the screen. The gasps from the packed gallery were immediate and audible. "This man," Brewer said, pointing to the screen, "is the same detective who led the investigation against Ryan Hale. He manipulated evidence, coerced witnesses, and framed an innocent man to cover his tracks." The room erupted in chaos. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. Lewis, sitting in the gallery with his lawyer, looked pale but defiant. "You're making a mistake," he hissed as he was escorted out in handcuffs. "You don't know what you've started." Brewer's stomach twisted as he absorbed the weight of what had just transpired. But despite the tension, he remained resolute. The case was now in the hands of a higher court, and Ryan Hale's conviction was under scrutiny. Brewer knew this was not the end, though. It was only the beginning of a much larger fight for justice. Weeks later, Brewer found himself once again in the same courtroom where Ryan had been sentenced. This time, however, the atmosphere felt different. The gallery was packed with reporters, activists, and Ryan's family, all awaiting the judge's decision on the retrial. Ryan, now thinner and visibly aged from his years behind bars, sat at the defense table. His posture was steady, his gaze unwavering. Brewer's heart tightened as he watched the young man who had been wrongfully convicted, whose life had been torn apart by a crime he didn't commit. The evidence Brewer and Hayes had gathered was undeniable. The surveillance footage, the falsified reports, the coerced testimonies, it all pointed to a web of corruption that had not only framed Ryan but had shielded the real criminals. When the presiding judge finally announced the decision to overturn Ryan's conviction, the courtroom erupted into applause. Tears streamed down Ryan's face as his mother rushed to embrace him. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Brewer, seated quietly at the back of the room, allowed himself a rare smile. Justice had been served, but it had come at a high cost. In the aftermath, the fallout spread far and wide. Detective Lewis was slapped with criminal charges for his role in the conspiracy, and an independent investigation into the Fresno Police Department uncovered a culture of corruption that had gone unchecked for years. The case became a rallying cry for justice reform, with Brewer's role at the forefront of a nationwide movement. Despite the accolades, Brewer remained introspective. He knew that this victory was just one battle in a much larger war. The justice system he had once trusted was flawed, but he believed it wasn't beyond repair. He was determined to spend the rest of his career fighting to fix it. For Ryan Hale, the journey had only just begun. Freed from the shackles of a wrongful conviction, he vowed to dedicate his life to helping others who had suffered the same fate. His story became a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of resilience and the unyielding pursuit of truth. The story of Ryan Hale and Judge Brewer serves as a powerful reminder that justice is not guaranteed. It requires vigilance, courage, and an unwavering commitment to uncover uncomfortable truths. If this story moved you, consider supporting organizations that fight for the wrongfully convicted and advocate for systemic reform. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge the way we see the world, because sometimes the fight for justice doesn't end in the courtroom. It begins there.